In 1991, in the state of Illinois, the Harrison family was living a peaceful life like any other young family. But in a single chaotic afternoon, everything suddenly plunged into a darkness no one could have foreseen. Baby David, only 4 months old, suddenly began vomiting violently, crying without stop, his breathing rapid, as if something were silently ravaging his tiny body from the inside. Laura Harrison, the young mother, panicked, scooped him up, and rushed to the car. Only one thought filled her mind. She had to get to the hospital as fast as possible. But amid the terror and the child's weakening cries, Laura took a wrong turn. Instead of reaching Chicago Children's Hospital as intended, she brought David to St. Mary's Hospital, a choice she would later believe marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. There, the test results left the doctors speechless. Traces of ethylene glycol, the antifreeze found in engine coolant, were detected in the baby's blood. A cold, razor-sharp conclusion that stabbed into the heart of any mother. 6 days later, David passed away, leaving Laura in indescribable grief. Then the police arrived. They believed she had poisoned her own child. 2 independent laboratories confirmed the findings. In her home, police also found bottles of engine coolant. To them, everything fit together in a terrifying way. Because of one wrong turn on the highway, Laura was thrust into the darkest journey of her life. While Laura Harrison sat behind bars, trying to survive the accusations and suspicious stares, she discovered she was pregnant again. No one could imagine the despair of a mother convicted of killing her child, while carrying new life inside her. That child, Michael, was born into that darkness. And only minutes after his first cry, he was taken from her and placed with a foster family. People said it was for his safety, a precaution, a way to keep the baby away from a woman they believed had killed David. But then, tragedy began to repeat itself. At just 3 weeks old, Michael's foster parents rushed him to the hospital. He started vomiting violently, growing weaker by the hour, breathing erratically as if being poisoned from within. His symptoms were identical to David's, so identical that the medical team was stunned. Not merely similar, not just a few overlapping signs, an exact copy, every symptom, every stage of decline. But this time, one fact was undeniable. Laura was in prison. She could not touch Michael. She could not feed him. She could not prepare his bottles. She could not poison him accidentally or deliberately. And that single fact began to shake the entire original theory to its core. If David had been poisoned, then who poisoned Michael? If Laura could not even touch her second child, why was history repeating itself with such chilling precision? Michael was transferred to a different hospital with a more specialized team. And there, for the first time, a doctor paused and asked, "Are we chasing the wrong culprit?" What they were about to discover would overturn the entire case and shatter every belief the justice system had clung to. When Michael arrived at the very hospital Laura had originally meant to take David to, everything began to change. The doctors didn't just look at lab results, they saw a repeating pattern. 2 different children, 2 different environments, 2 different times, yet the symptoms were identical, as if copied from the same painful script. One doctor asked a question no one had considered before: if it's not poison, what is their body producing on its own? From that question, the truth slowly emerged. Michael underwent a series of deeper, more specialized tests, and then a name appeared: MMA, methylmalonic acidemia, an extremely rare metabolic disorder so uncommon that many doctors might practice their entire lives without ever seeing a single case. Patients with MMA lack a critical enzyme that prevents the body from properly processing certain nutrients. As a result, the body produces propionic acid, a toxic metabolite that builds up in the blood, causing vomiting, labored breathing, seizures, and multi-organ failure. Symptoms identical to poisoning. At that moment, every doctor in the room realized they were holding the decisive key, and then came the twist that sent chills through the medical community. Propionic acid and ethylene glycol antifreeze on early 1990s lab equipment have nearly identical chemical signatures. 2 completely different substances, yet they looked almost the same on the graphs. In other words, the tests may have detected propionic acid from but due to the technological limitations of the time, it was misread as ethylene glycol, turning a loving mother into a murderer. Michael's blood immediately showed abnormally high levels of propionic acid, and if Michael had David almost certainly carried the same genetic mutation. A new hypothesis, dark yet hopeful, emerged for Laura. David may never have been poisoned. He may have died from a rare disease, not by his mother's hand, but to prove it, someone brave enough to reopen the entire case would be needed, and that person was about to appear. The discoveries about MMA opened a new path. But Laura's exoneration required more than intuition. It required evidence. Someone had to challenge the conclusions of two major laboratories, and that someone appeared in the most unexpected way. One evening, as the television program Unsolved Mysteries aired Laura Harrison's case, a leading biochemist professor, James Koppel, watched in silence, studying every detail. He didn't know Laura or her family, but he knew the flaws of machines, and something in the story deeply unsettled him. Why did two children in completely different environments show identical symptoms? Why had no one considered a metabolic disorder? And most importantly, could laboratories truly distinguish between ethylene glycol and propionic acid? He immediately contacted the authorities and requested David's blood samples. The very samples once thought to prove Laura's guilt. This time he did not use 1990s technology. He used gas chromatography, a far more advanced method that could examine molecules directly instead of relying on ambiguous graphs, and when the results came back, the room fell silent. No ethylene glycol, no antifreeze, only propionic acid, the unmistakable signature of MMA. If true, David had suffered from the same genetic disorder as his brother, and Laura may have served time for a crime she never committed. But Professor Koppel didn't stop there. He needed to prove the error was not an isolated incident. It could happen in any lab using outdated equipment. He conducted a bold experiment. He sent samples of propionic acid to 8 laboratories across the United States with no notes or hints, simply asking them to analyze and report. When the reports came back, he didn't know whether to be furious or horrified. Nearly half of the labs misidentified propionic acid as ethylene glycol. The exact mistake that had sent Laura to prison had been replicated. Now the truth was no longer a theory. It had been scientifically proven, and the doors of Laura's prison finally began to shake when Professor Koppel's evidence reached the courts. Laura Harrison's case turned around instantly. The precise analysis proved David had never been poisoned. The so-called traces of ethylene glycol that convicted Laura were in fact the result of MMA, rare disorder virtually unknown to the doctors at the first hospital. That ignorance had led to the most devastating misunderstanding imaginable. After more than 2 years behind bars, Laura was finally exonerated. She was released, and all charges were officially dropped. But the wrongful conviction could not return what mattered most. David was gone, and his final moments had been spent without his mother. Laura walked out of prison empty-handed, carrying a wound that would never heal, the wound of a mother robbed of the right to hold her child one last time. The tragedy did not end there. Michael, Laura's second son, also diagnosed with MMA, grew up under the care of relatives. Laura poured all her love, regret, and hope into him, praying fate would give her child a brighter path. But MMA is a merciless disease. Despite the family's best efforts, Michael passed away in 2015 at just 24 years old. 2 children, 2 cruel fates, one mother who lost both, all caused by a chain of errors that should never have happened. Hospital oversight, ignorance of MMA, rushed judgments, and a legal system that trusted assumptions more than truth. Even when those mistakes were corrected, far too much had already been lost. Laura was exonerated, but the pain of losing both children would remain forever, a tragic ending to a story that should never have had to be so tragic in the human body. More than 20,000 proteins work tirelessly, forming an invisible, seemingly perfect assembly line. Yet the absence of just one single protein in MMA patients is enough to turn ordinary breast milk and formula into poison inside their bodies, and just one laboratory-era faulty machine, a few atoms difference invisible to the naked eye, was enough to turn a loving mother into a murderer in the eyes of the law. David was gone, Michael would follow, and Laura survived carrying grief, guilt, and an exoneration that arrived far too late. The Harrison family's story is more than a bizarre medical case. It is a brutal reminder that sometimes it is not crime, but human and systemic failures that destroy a life. One moment, one flawed test result, and an entire life is changed forever. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. I wish all of you good health, good luck, and plenty of joy. Remember to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories, better and more interesting ones. Thank you.